May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Well, gosh, these are some readings. I'm going to start someplace else, though. I'll get around to them. For the past 2 weeks, I've been busy with a class that I've been auditing online through the University of the South at Sewanee. Sewanee is a big name in Episcopal circles. It's one of a handful of Episcopal-affiliated colleges in the country. And it's home to one of the 10 official Episcopal seminaries. I've always known that it was one of our places, although I'd never been there. But growing up in New England, Sewanee, which is located in Tennessee, was never truly at the forefront of my radar. Every now and again, it would show up in my attention, though. When I was in high school, a seminarian from Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge and Sewanee grad spent 2 years interning at my home parish. Again, when it came time for me to apply to college, my mother encouraged me to look at Episcopal schools, so Sewanee came up again. And again, when I was applying to seminary, Sewanee was on the short list, always at the periphery. Sewanee had caught my attention in particular, however, this winter, when Gideon and I went to the Consortium of Endowed Episcopal Parishes, SEEP, conference, which was in Louisville, Kentucky. One of the advertised panels was about how Sewanee, officially the University of the South, was confronting racism and the history of their institution. I was struck by the bravery of the concept, and even more drawn in by the fact that it was also being led by a woman that I knew from Boston, Hannah Pomershine, a recent Sewanee grad from their seminary. The presentation, once I got there, might as well have been designed to draw me in. Some of you may not know this about me, but I love history. I love stories, I love heritage, I love rummaging around through old dusty boxes and looking at yellowed papers for hints about the people who have come before me. I've been up at our own St. John Cemetery begging John Papa to let me into the oldest archives. I've traced my own genealogy back to colonial Virginia, moving backwards through Chicago and California to the Black Hills of Montana, the San Francisco Gold Rush, a period farming in Missouri and in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and even as Quaker whalers on Nantucket. My family seemed to be everywhere. I know some of you share this passion for history and genealogy, tracing your ancestors back to the American Revolution, to some of the 13 original colonies and beyond. Some of you are also experts at the history of our community here on Long Island, of Cold Spring Harbor, of Oyster Bay, and of Huntington. Some of the writers of the Bible also clearly had the history bug. They had a sense of the importance of telling the stories of those who came before us, and how those stories have helped to shape our identity. The stories of Genesis are particularly like this, attempting to trace the story of humanity from the very beginning of time. In today's story, the story of Sarah and Hagar, we know Sarah's genealogy back to Adam. Descended from Terah, she shares a genealogy with her half-brother and husband, Abraham. They go back through Noah's son, Shem, the, if I count it right, 8 times great-grandson of Adam. Hagar's genealogy, on the other hand, is unknown to us. We know that she is Egyptian, and we know that she is enslaved. Even her name provides no clues, as it means only foreigner, quote, in the Hebrew language. It's not really a name at all. The Hebrew Bible scholar Wilda C. Gaffney points out that it strains credulity that Hagar's parents would ever have given her such a name. It seems more likely that it came from her Hebrew enslavers. It's possible that Hagar was first enslaved by Pharaoh when Abram and Sarai were in Egypt, before their names changed. We know Pharaoh gave Abram both male and female slaves in exchange for Sarai, but we are not told who the enslaved people were. And so Hagar's genealogy is lost to us. I too had recently been faced with a genealogy challenge that I could not crack. One that you may also be interested in if you've been paying close attention to the preaching at St. John's or have been over to any of our cleanups. And that's the conundrum of the St. John's Harbor Road burying ground. Outside of the two formal markers, we have no idea who the possibly as many as 200 people are who were buried on that piece of land. We do know that the Thorns, who are named on the two formal gravestones, were Black residents of Cold Spring Harbor. And we know that in previous eras it was called the, quote, slave cemetery, implying it was mostly for Black people. By the way, we are calling it now the Harbor Road Burying Ground because in a meeting with partner organizations, including members of the historical societies of both Oyster Bay and Huntington, and various African American stakeholder organizations in the town of Huntington, everyone agreed that the colloquial slave cemetery was neither necessarily totally accurate, important, nor necessarily kind to the memory of those who rest there. But more to the point, we have been having a hard time learning who might be buried there. And I was interested to see how another Episcopal organization with historic ties to slavery and the African American population might approach thinking about their story. Even logistically, how do you learn more? The presentation from the leaders of Sewannee's Robeson Project promised to provide me with just such a guide. They examined in unflinching detail everything from the financial entanglements of their founders to the various language that was used in pamphlets circulated by the two Episcopal bishops who led the charge for Sewannee's founding. It was musty old boxes at their very best, and I was hooked. I wanted to know more about their work, much more, but I wasn't sure how to achieve that. But when our global pandemic hit, my window of opportunity opened, and their summer sessions went online. Lo and behold, the faculty of the Robeson Project were offering a class over Zoom, which would invite students into exploring the history of race and the Episcopal Church through the lens of the University of the South. And so this is how I spent the past week researching every detail of a family who had been enslaved by one of those two bishops, Bishop and Confederate General Leonidas Polk, one of the founders of Sewanee. Listed as a family unit on a bill of sale in 1854, we were assigned to track down Altamore and his wife, Winnie, both about 30 years old, and their two children, Taylor, 5 years old, and Nora, 1. We were told to use Ancestry.com and any other online resources that we could think of. I was mesmerized by the story of Taylor McKeithen. He was truly a fascinating individual. We later learned that their family surname, McKeithen, is taken from the original enslavers that they were born to in North Carolina. Taylor was an entrepreneur. He filed a patent in 1874 for a lemon squeezer, and he moved up in his career in the hospitality and entertainment industry, working at a jockey club, and finally at a famous New Orleans establishment for fun and entertainment, the Astoria. He was civic-minded, registering to vote, serving as a polling official, joining the Odd Fellows, and helping to plan an Emancipation Day celebration in 1912. And despite having been enslaved by an Episcopal bishop, Taylor was a faithful Episcopalian his whole life. He was married in an Episcopal church by the first Black priest in the state of Louisiana, Charles Henry Thompson, and he served as a warden at that same church at the Louisiana Diocesan Convention in 1918. Genealogy work for many Black Americans is often very frustrating, much more like the story of Hagar than like my story. You can only get so far before you reach what is called the brick wall. The 1870 census is often as far back as many Black Americans can trace their ancestry, because the names of enslaved people and women were not previously recorded by census officials. Those lucky few who can find out who enslaved their ancestors can often go no further back than one generation into captivity. But this does not mean that they didn't have full lives and stories worthy of being remembered, like the one we hear from Taylor McKeithen. God had promised life to them as well. The promise of life and of descendants was on my mind as we came to the story of Sarah calling on Abraham to cast out the woman they had enslaved because of Sarah's jealousy. God reiterates to Abraham the promise he has made through Hagar and through her son Ishmael. God says, "I will make a nation of him also." And so Abraham sends Hagar into the wilderness with no more than bread and a little water, which runs out far too quickly. Hagar fears death for herself and her child. But God hears the cries of the boy and comes to Hagar. Not for the first time, and indeed something of a conundrum when we learn about how in the story of Moses that those who see God will die. Hagar sees God and does not die. And when God appears to Hagar, he repeats the promise that he made, and he opens her eyes to a well. They, Hagar and Ishmael, are saved by the God who sees, El Roi. This is the name that Hagar gave to God, and she is the only human being to do so, to give a name to God in the whole Bible. The God who sees the peril of Hagar the girl enslaved by Abraham and Sarah, and he comes to her side. It should not come as a surprise that Hagar has been an inspiration to generations of outsiders, and especially to the descendants of Black Africans enslaved in our country, sometimes calling themselves the sons and daughters of Hagar. Today, many of you will be honoring Father's Day, hello Dad, and remembering some of the very closest of our ancestors. Some of our fathers are still among us, and some have passed into eternal life. Some of us are blessed with happy and healthy relationships with our fathers, and others have more conflicted feelings, ranging from simply not getting along on the one hand to, unfortunately, more severe forms of abuse or neglect. We as a culture have had a hard time confronting difficult stories. Often we'd much prefer silence than the truth of what went wrong. This is true in our history and in our personal relationships. We would prefer all stories of noble deeds and loving kindness. The gospel, however, assures us, even in the hard stories, of God's love and commitment. But it does not promise us an easy road. Jesus says that the work of following him will set a man against his father and a daughter against her mother. Once again, so much for Father's Day. But the reminder is that the work of confronting truth can sometimes be divisive. We, as Christians, are called to do something more than our culture demands, something that is modeled in God's response to Hagar both of the times she sees him in the wilderness. God sees her suffering, and he hears her cries. As Christians, our record on slavery is a bit spotty, and you can see language which either assumes it as a paradigm all over the scriptures or affirms it, including all three of our readings today. But even as they do so, the scriptures also, more importantly, reaffirm God's commitment to the smallest of creatures. Each sparrow is known. Even the hairs on your head are counted. How can we also affirm our attention to the smallest? How can we listen? How can we see? How can our attention follow God's attention, even in the hard times? One commentary I read this week observed, as we turn from allegiance to the forces of sin that deaden us, we become aware of the efforts they have had on us, the effects they have had on us, How our compassion has been stretched thin, how our empathy has either burnt out or worn over, how our anger and our grief has become tamed with time, distraction, or cultural pressure. And in that new life, we see all this as a great loss. We work to heal from the inside what has been taken from us. And the more we are able to become alive again to God in the world through the full range of human feeling, we are also made alive to all of the pain, horror, and possibilities that surround us. The resurrected life reveals acutely all that need not be. While this aliveness is indeed always a hopeful encounter, it is not always a happy or easy one. It calls us to the depths of grief and the heights of anger when the fullness of life is denied us, our neighbors, or the planet. The same commentary offers this prayer that I will end with. God, for all that you feel in solidarity with us, we give you thanks. You weep with the heartbroken. You share in anger over cruelty and disregard for life. You delight in our simple joys and extraordinary awakenings. May your care and concern draw us more deeply into love for one another. May we be faithful companions to all who long to know they do not weep, rage, or celebrate alone. Amen.